Hi, this is Rob Eirich with the University of Nebraska Extension, as well as the Nebraska Director of Beef Quality Assurance. Today we're going to go through a brief presentation on handling cattle during high heat indexes here in Nebraska and give you some guidelines that you can follow as your employees as well as yourself work these cattle during the summer months when we have high temperatures as well as high humidity across Nebraska. I think when you look at the guidelines for handling livestock during these high stress times, I think all of us kind of have a general idea of these particular guidelines, and we'll go more into depth about each one of them. But the main guidelines are always handling cattle in the early mornings when it's cooler, processing cattle when we have smaller groups where they're not having to stand as long and so forth, trying to move cattle shorter distances during this period of time, and also providing those cooling opportunities, whether it be shade or sprinklers, throughout the whole facilities of the yard. The last thing we'll talk about is compromised animals and how compromised animals are at a higher risk than the other animals that we are working with in the yard during these times. So let's talk about handling these animals in the early hours. When we start talking about handling before that temperature gets too high, we talk about trying to work cattle in between the hours of 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. when those temperatures are lower and we don't have we're not in the heat of the day. It's important that we don't try to go after that 10 o'clock because that's when we are starting to see those temperatures starting to get up into the higher risk times of the day. And so we always want to kind of maintain working them early in the morning. We're going to, in a minute, show you a chart of heat indexes and how that temperature and humidity changes through the day and kind of those critical places we need to look at. One of the things that we talk about when we talk about handling cattle and temperatures, we have to think not only the temperature outside, but we're really talking about the heat stress on the animal itself and that core temperature. When we think about that, the animal's core temperature starts to peak approximately 2 hours after the environmental temperature peaks. And so when we look at the heat of the day, those animals are still absorbing that heat and that temperature rises and that core temperature rises. Once that core temperature rises, we keep thinking, well, maybe we can handle cattle as we get later in the day and those evenings when the temperatures start to decrease. Well, we have to remember that it takes approximately 6 or more hours for that temperature to decrease or dissipate from that high core peak of that day. So when we start to look at the heat of the day, approximately, let's say 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it'll be 4 o'clock when that animal's core temperature peaks. But then for that animal to cool back down to get that core temperature down a little bit further, it's going to take another 6 hours. So we're talking now 10 o'clock at night before that core temperature really decreases to the point where they're not quite as high risk for heat stress and so forth. So when we look at that, evenings probably aren't always the core time or the peak time of when we need to be working these animals. We still need to target those early morning hours where those temperatures are lower and those animals have had time to rest through the evening to drop that core temperature a little bit. So let's take a look at the whole idea behind beef cattle temperature humidity chart here when we start to think about that humidity indexes and how we have to have those key times and how we look at this as a planning tool. When we look at the averages as far as humidity and temperatures in Nebraska in July, August, and September, most of the time we're talking in that 65 to 68% humidity during those months, and our average temperature in those months range right around 86 to 88. Those are the daily average temperatures. So we have to remember where those peaks, and that is the average temperature of the whole day. So when we start to look at that, we can look at, let's say we're just going to use 65% humidity, and maybe that average temperature of 86, and we come across here, and our heat index is already at a 81, but the thing that we look at is we're already into that danger category at 88 with 65% humidity. And so we have to kind of plan those days because there's a lot of days, those early morning temperatures are fairly high, and that's usually when that humidity is the highest, is in that early morning, and it starts to maybe drop just a little bit as the day goes on. But yet, we still have to think about, okay, let's say a 90 degree, and we're talking about 65% humidity. Now we move up, and we're in the emergency category. So again, when we start planning those days and start planning movement, processing, and shipping of those cattle, we have to maintain and understand this chart and have it available that way you and your management, your core team can really look at the strategy and the planning process of what we're trying to do with handling those animals throughout the day. The next guide is processing in smaller groups. One of the things that we look at holding facilities and processing areas, you really never want those animals to be standing in those areas much longer than 30 to 45 minutes. And so we might have to think about how we process those cattle where we have smaller groups that we don't have them standing in those high pressure areas that might not have the cooling, and the shade is what we want. And so that way we don't have the risk of that stress already there, plus the heat stress, and it really starts to affect the performance of these cattle. So if we can start looking at processing in smaller groups where we can work it through a little bit quicker without having them kind of tighten those processing holding areas. Just normal cattle handling is we never want to overcrowd these areas because, again, that reduces the area of airflow and some of that cooling that we're looking at, especially in the high heat index times of the year. We already know we talked about that core temperature, and so when we start to process cattle, and usually trying to use low stress handling where we don't have that increase in core temperature, because automatically just working cattle, no matter what time of year, we have that core temperature increase because of the stress level of just doing that in normal conditions. And so, again, we're putting stress on top of the heat stress. And so, again, we implement higher risk type of cattle. So if we can maintain smaller groups that we can process in a quicker, faster way, but yet using low stress without having too much pressure on those cattle, we're going to benefit in the long run, especially during this heat stress time in the summer. One of the other things that we talk about when we talk about working cattle and moving cattle throughout the yard, we have to really think about kind of how we plan to move cattle throughout the yard. Really, timely movement of cattle is very important because shorter distances will cause less stress on these animals, and trying to move them across from one end of the yard to a loadout facility, going all the way across the yard, it's going to be higher pressure and higher stress on those animals, but also the heat index increases and that heat stress. And then when we put them on a truck, again, the heat stress time, if we can move them shorter distances and be timely about that movement in those early mornings, we can move those cattle, and strategic plans as far as pen movements is very key as we kind of get throughout the year, throughout that feeding process, and moving those heavier cattle closer and closer to your shipping area might be some strategic planning and pen movements that are important to us in the yard. And so, again, planning is always important. Keep management up on a lot of this, and also think about when we have these movements, is think a little bit more about those emergency plans as we look at the stress on the cattle and those heat indexes throughout this whole process of the feeding phase. And so if we can do that timely movement, strategic planning, we can really decrease the risk of heat stress on these type of cattle as far as handling and movement goes. I think it's always important, and there's a lot of research out there and a lot of opportunities that producers can really look at. What are some of the areas that we can improve on trying to give these cattle cool areas and shaded areas to keep that heat stress down as much as possible? And so when we look at that, there's three basic ways of doing that: improving shaded areas, sprinkler usage, as well as just increasing airflow. And so even in our handling facilities, we have to think about that in our processing facilities. How do we increase that opportunity for shade and cooling, but yet that airflow is going to be so important. So again, we have to target this as some of the most important ways if we can reduce it, because again, as we handle and we start to move cattle, it's automatically their heat, their core temperature increases. And so again, putting stress on top of heat stress, we have a lot more risk of the cattle being poor performing, and then also having some concerns with some of our animals in the feed garden. So again, keep on top of those things and keep thinking about how to improve those type of scenarios in your yard. The last thing we're going to talk about today is compromised animals. Sometimes we look at compromised animals, and I think we need to define that first. And compromised animals are those animals that are chronic. They are the animals that are in the hospital, lame, poor performing. These are the animals that just, they're a higher risk for us in this circumstances as far as heat stress. And so we have to really think about how do we handle those type of compromised animals in the summer months as well. Because things we have to remember when we talk about heat stress, these animals already have normally they're fevered, they're having problems health-wise, and so that body temperature is already risen to a extreme or a high risk level. And so when we think about that, now we put them in a stressful situation of high heat index. And so again, they're higher risk and we have more problems because they're elevated temperature already. But the other things that we looked at is they also have less water intake and less feed intake. And so we need to be able to help make that more easily or readily available to these animals to try to do whatever we can to reduce that body temperature in this type of scenario and not trying to get elevated above the stress level and the extremes. These cattle also have a tendency of not wanting to move, and they're usually they're weak, and they don't, once they sit, they don't move from that area. And so if we can provide extra shading, cooling, and just mainly airflow in those pens, I think you're going to minimize the stress of the whole idea behind the heat index already on top of the compromised animals and the body temperature being high at that point. So when you think about how we handle animals during heat stress, I believe we're still in that scenario of if we can manage it with keeping them cool, keeping those animals where they have airflow, we can reduce some of the effects of heat stress. But again, handling those animals, it's a necessity at most of our yards on a daily basis for some. And so we have to think about how do we handle and move those animals. And so keep in mind, early hours, keeping them cool in the mornings, having additional opportunities for cooling and airflow, sprinklers, shaded areas, and try to not have those cattle overcrowding in a small holding area for any longer than 30 minutes. So just thinking about those guidelines, I think we're on top of where we need to be. If there's any more questions about handling animals during this period of high heat indexes, please feel free to contact me as the Director of Beef Quality Assurance in Nebraska and UNL Extension Educator at either one of my contact opportunities, either phone or by email, or you can visit our website at bqa.unl.edu. Thank you.